rights challenges and opportunities. Lisa is on the call today as well as a few of the Bonavera colleagues who are helping with the technology and admin matters. Thank you very much to all of them. Today, we are hosting a very interesting talk by Marisa McVey, who is a PhD candidate at the University of St. Andrews, having recently completed her visiting fellowship at the University of California, Berkeley. Her PhD thesis focuses on critically analyzing companies' implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the impact of transposing human rights into different corporate contexts. And today, Marisa will share with us some insights from her research, drawing on two case studies, a bank and an oil gas company. Before I give floor to Marisa, I just want to make a few admin announcements. First of all, we ask you to keep mute throughout and also switch off your video. Second, we'll be locking this event to 30 minutes for security reasons. It means that if you want at some point to leave, you won't be able to rejoin again. There will be opportunity to ask questions. We'll hold a Q&A session with the speaker in due course. You can either type your question in the chat box, you can see it in the bottom of the screen, or you can ask using audio, but you still need to indicate in the chat box that you have by typing your name. We will then give you floor in due course. Finally, I just want to say that it's a very interesting experience and unique experience for the Bonavera Institute and OxBHR to organize events online, because most of the time we're meeting either in Oxford or in London. But we are quite excited about this opportunity, and we are very looking forward to reach wider business and human rights community. We have started to plan our autumn semester, and we still think that even if the things go back to normal, we might be hosting some of the events online. And if you have any ideas about the panel discussions, or you want to present an ongoing work, or you are thinking about collaborate with us at some point, please message us. The autumn semester will be running in October, December, so there is an opportunity to do something interesting together. Enough of talking from me for now. Marisa, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to learn more. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katya, and thank you very much to the Bonavera Institute and OxBHR as well for this opportunity, and Lisa as well for the invite. I'm just going to share my screen with you. I've got a few slides to share if I can find this and work out Zoom in general, because I'm not particularly good at this. Let me see if that works. Okay. So, as Katya said, I am in my final year of my PhD at St. Andrews, the School of Management, and I'm currently writing up some of my findings and thinking about my findings from my data collection last year. So I'm very, very grateful to be here and discuss some of the kind of initial findings, specifically on this idea of translating human rights into the corporate sphere. And my thoughts on these issues and themes that have kind of been flowing from the data are very fluid, so I really do welcome any feedback or questions that you might have at the end. But if we just start now, I will kind of talk a little bit first about what I'm going to talk about during this presentation. So I'm sure many of you on the call today are very aware of the business and human rights context and the guiding principles as well. But I am just going to give a quick recap for people that maybe aren't that familiar, and looking kind of at the outstanding issues in business and human rights scholarship at the minute, and how maybe my thesis objectives and my methodology has kind of flowed from the outstanding issues that we might have. So, something in the chat there. Okay. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat there. Okay, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of translating human rights into the corporate space and some issues that we might encounter with translation as well. And then if we have time, we can talk about kind of the next steps in my research and where I hope to go from there as well. So, many of you will be familiar, obviously, with the growing academic and practitioner-based field of business and human rights. The context in which the business and human rights takes place. So I'm just going to give you a very quick recap here. So the business and human rights field is concerned with how businesses may impact human rights and the various ways in which such violations can be prevented and addressed. And it's become very self-evident how multinational corporate power in particular and influence can really affect people's lives. And this is combined with the transnational character and the complex corporate structure that many of these corporations have, make them very slippery characters to hold accountable for human rights abuse. And all of this is compounded, obviously, by the fact that in international law, it's very difficult to hold private actors to account for human rights abuses, particularly since the state is still seen as a primary duty bearer for human rights. And as such, there's now a broad, though it has been challenged somewhat, agreement that businesses should do no harm and have a responsibility to respect human rights and should be held accountable when they don't respect or uphold these responsibilities. So now kind of one of the most prominent questions we have is this idea of what mechanisms can we use to hold businesses accountable for human rights. It's simultaneously a practical movement. The field itself has kind of emerged from a lot of different disciplines, law, public policy, business, and it kind of is looking at practical ways in which to hold corporations accountable and trying to, just managed to go ahead again. There we go. And I'm giving you like an insight into this before we even got onto those slides. And also advocating for the adoption of human rights centered business practices. And it's obviously an academic subject as well. So since multinational corporations make very difficult regulatory targets, there have been numerous attempts to hold them accountable for human rights. We have many different tools that we can use. So we have had things like transnational tort litigation. We've got hard law like the UK Modern Slavery Act or the French Vigilance Law. And there's also been obviously a plethora of soft law as well. And the most prominent of these being the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were created by the Special Representative, Professor John Ruggie, and they were adopted unanimously by the Human Rights Council in 2011. They're based on the 3 pillars that you can see on the slides here. The state duty to protect, the corporate responsibility to respect, and the need for access to effective remedy for victims of corporate human rights abuse. Now, I realise the UN Guiding Principles themselves aren't without fault. They're frequently critically assessed on their non-binding nature and this idea of the principle pragmatist approach which Ruggie adopted in relation to the extent of corporate obligations for human rights. And we've seen, some of the kind of weaknesses that have come from Pillar 3 as well. And while these criticisms are both very valid and concerning, we can't deny that the Guiding Principles and the reporting and assurance frameworks created by Shift and Mazars are widely endorsed by the business community, and partly, I'm sure, because of this flexible and non-binding nature, and they're actively used as a method of demonstrating their corporate responsibility as well. And it would also, just before we move on, be remiss of me not to mention that, of course, we are having ongoing negotiations at the UN level for the binding treaty on transnational entities and their human rights duties. But for today, what I'm really interested in is the idea of the guiding principles and how they're utilised and interpreted by corporate management. So the business and human rights academic field is consolidating, but we do have these kind of gaps that are in our knowledge. In 3 particular ways, which I'm demonstrating on the board or on the slides with 3 quotes. So the first quote is from the editors of the Business and Human Rights Journal. The editors note their concern for the lack of empirical analysis within the field, and in particular they note the need for more empirical work on how the guiding principles are implemented by corporations. The second quote there is from Karen Bowman and her colleagues running in the Nordic Journal for Human Rights. The need to engage more decisively in a variety of disciplines outside of the traditionally rather legal-centered analysis. And though I think this is, changing as time goes on, there is certainly an influx of multidisciplinary perspectives in the field as well. And that's all of this is just to say that when building the guiding principles or when creating the guiding principles, Ruggie did draw on the social sciences and other disciplines in order to inform his ideas of corporate responsibility as well. And a quote that I haven't really included there is one from Florian Betstein's paper in 2015, which calls for a more critical voice in the business and human rights field. And finally then, as Christian Shepherd points out, there's also a need to understand how human rights practices are understood and interpreted and implemented in the everyday in order to understand how particular methods and how effective these particular methods are in ensuring corporate accountability for human rights. So those are just three instances where I think we need more work in the business and human rights field. And this is what brings me on then to my own thesis objectives and kind of what my PhD research is looking at. So in light of the three research gaps, my PhD asks, well, what happens when human rights are placed into a corporate space through the implementation of the guiding principles? Specifically, I wanted to know more about who is involved in the process and what impact actors have. And how do these understandings and interpretations of the guiding principles impact upon corporate accountability for human rights? So I've kind of drawn on the social sciences and the social constructivist idea on how accountability is seen as a social practice. And I've also looked at social and environmental and critical accounting to kind of help draw kind of inspiration on the questions that I'm asking. And yes, accounting can be interesting, and we can talk about that a bit later as well. So accountability tools which aid in the construction and the giving of an account by a corporation, like human rights due diligence under the guiding principles and things like the reporting and assurance framework, are not neutral or technical instruments. They are interpreted and constructed by those who utilize them. And this is simultaneously the fact that the entrenchment of the guiding principles as a primary method of discharging their corporate accountability means that the accountability practices within the UN guiding principles construct a particular reality of what you might see corporate accountability looking like. And also it helps to inform actors' worldviews on human rights as well. So to understand this process, it's imperative to look at both how the guiding principles are understood and interpreted and implemented in different contexts, and who's undertaking these processes as well. So to help me with this investigation, I looked at two case studies in particular. The first, these are really not very imaginatively named. The first is O1, which is an oil and gas company. And the second is a bank called O2. Preliminarily, I looked for companies who were kind of actively undertaking human rights reporting under the guiding principles. And this was kind of for selfish reasons, to ensure that I had kind of a rich data set to analyse. And out of these two candidates, or out of the candidates that I looked at, O1 and O2 emerged as the most feasible. So I undertook in-depth and semi-structured interviews with internal employees of each company and in their human rights or sustainability departments. And actually I did talk to other people outside of these departments who kind of used the guiding principles in their everyday work. So for example, in the case of the oil and gas company, I looked at or I talked to participants who maybe worked as community liaison officers near pipelines. I also attended the bank's human rights workshop to kind of gain a little bit more insight into how they understood human rights. And I undertook a document analysis of each company's human rights report. And all this happened between October 2018 and December 2019 as well. And there's also a sort of third party to these case studies. The multidimensional nature of the guiding principles requires this kind of external input into a company's reporting practices or when they implement a human rights strategy. And the UN guiding principles themselves mention experts and expert input quite a lot, although they are quite vague in who experts are. I think they talk about governments, multi-stakeholder initiatives, and human rights institutions. So doesn't really elucidate very much further on where this expertise is, but I find this a really interesting thing because in reality, when I started talking to people, there was a lot of reference to our external, the external experts. And so I thought that, you know, I can't really leave these participants out and these people who help shape what the human rights look like or what the guiding principles are, how they're adopted in the corporate space. So I had to include these as well. So those are like the little triangles on the bottom of the slide there. Those are not all of the kind of organizations that I talked to, but they're just an example of the variety of organizations that are out there discussing human rights or helping to implement human rights into the workspace. So just to talk a little bit then of kind of this theme that's emerged pretty recently from my findings, and it's this idea of translation. So the concept of translation came up quite organically from both external and internal participants. And this is when I was kind of asking them to describe their job role and how they saw their role in putting human rights, or making sure that human rights were understood in a corporate space. And you can see there from a quote from P22, who's a human rights consultant, talking about this idea of translation. And this came up quite a bit with a range of different participants. So during data analysis, then I drew on kind of extant literature on non-linguistic translation from different disciplines. I looked at the sociology of translation, management and accounting studies, and also human rights research in anthropology as well, to help kind of make sense of this data. And for the purposes of this research, then, translation depicts how the meaning of human rights and the practice of corporate accountability for human rights is developed in the corporate setting. And in the process of translation, translators take the ideas and practices of one group and present them in terms that another group will accept. Translation is an inherently political process, given its effect on the constant construction and reconstruction of issues. Through this framing, I was really able to kind of learn more about how to kind of frame this idea of transposing human rights into the corporate context. So internal translators, those who worked within the Human Rights Department or the Sustainability Department, form a really intrinsic part of this translation process, as you might expect. They're tremendously passionate about human rights and believe in the power of human rights to transform businesses. And they are the key actors who embed human rights into business. And they use this idea, this is something that Sally Mary, the legal anthropologist, talks about, this idea of dual consciousness. And it's where someone is kind of in the middle of two different contexts. So they have, with the internal participants that I talked to, they were very aware and knowledgeable about human rights, but they also were obviously embedded in their everyday corporate context and working in that corporate context. So this really enabled them to bring human rights in and to make it understandable in businesses. So my external translators, who were the kind of external experts that advised on human rights issues, had to translate human rights ideas to the corporate setting, but also to rights holders as well, if they were conducting things like human rights impact assessments. And they had to be really adaptable and comfortable in different settings when translating. And they also there was a lot of kind of negotiation of their perceived independence throughout. And they also had to be able to be quite forceful when needed to, but they had to be diplomatic as well. So there was a lot of different nuances within their role. And to persuade colleagues, both internal and external translators dressed human rights up in familiar costumes. And this is another phrase that I'm borrowing from Sally Mary. So a lot of the time there was linking negative human rights impacts to economic costs in order to make this link understandable within a corporate setting. So just kind of a few themes then that, or a few issues I think that come out of this process of translation through the guiding principles. So as we talked about, message framing or translation is a political project. So when we translate concepts, we move something from one context to make it understandable in another. But in doing so, we also intrinsically change the concept in order to make it understandable in this other context. And during data collection, it was clear that the process of putting human rights into the corporate space was never straightforward. There was negotiation, and there was also quite a lot of examples of when human rights concepts got lost in translation. So I spoke to a participant who worked in the bank's sustainability department, and they were talking to the CFO of the bank and trying to help them understand about human rights and why human rights were so applicable to business. And the CFO, responded, well, human rights are to do with, I think it was secret prisons and torture, and we don't deal with any of those things, so we don't really need to be concerned about that. So this idea of being able to contextualize human rights and make it applicable to business was really key. And I think that contextualization came up a lot. Nearly every participant I spoke to talked about context is key, and it's reflected in the guiding principles as well. But in order to contextualize human rights, sometimes the language of human rights was neutralized in some way. So if you look at the quote from P9, they talk about the guiding principles being using very neutral language. So taking out, say, things like violations from the lexicon of human rights was a way to make businesses understand them, businesses more open to implementing things like that. So the guiding principles were helpful because they removed incendiary language. And other participants also spoke of this toning down of human rights when interacting with colleagues within a corporation, but also when advising businesses on their human rights impacts. The second issue that I think is quite important, that I think comes out of this process of translation, is this idea of reinforcing hierarchies. So placing human rights in the corporate space put our translators, so our internal and external translators, in a really powerful position, because they provide this link between rights holders and headquarters, or where potential human rights impacts may take place and where human rights policies are created. Many translators felt that the guiding principles weren't really helpful when talking to rights holders. And I think that's quite understandable, given that they are quite full of business language. But I do think that an issue occurs when rights holder grievances or rights holder experiences is then translated into corporate policy or into corporate reporting using the guiding principles. And those who do this translation can be seen as kind of knowledge brokers between the rights holders and the corporate headquarters, for example. And this ability to repackage grievances to make them more acceptable to, say, a corporate level as well. And I'm not saying my participants did this consciously or did this on purpose, but the idea of repackaging our grievances is something that I think happens through the process of using the guiding principles. And here I'm reminded of the sociologist Michel Calon, who talks about when we speak for others' lived experiences, it first requires silencing those in whose name we speak. So these are just some kind of thoughts that I've been having on the issue of translation. And finally, then, this idea of corporatization, which is something that that Kristen Shepard talks about in his work on human rights, and the idea that because the guiding principles and their supplementary material utilize economic language and make human rights more understandable and palatable for businesses, they also privilege managerial language when assessing human rights standards. And it's unsurprising that when using the guiding principles, translators who might need to engage with colleagues and clients are frequently faced with a kind of commercial pressure, and often it might come up in the translation of human rights into economic risks or gains. And one thing I found really interesting was the idea of branding human rights. So if you look at the quote from P19, who worked at the bank, they talk about they talk about the marketing value of the guiding principles. And I think this is a really interesting quote, and other participants did speak of the Sustainable Development Goals in comparison to the guiding principles and how they were kind of a better link for businesses. They created a better link for businesses. But also I think what we need to be careful of is this idea of, are we, in using the guiding principles and with the fact that they are being, the language is kind of being toned down, are we making human rights work for business rather than for transformative justice? And I think that's just something that needs to be borne in mind. So to sum up, kind of, what I'm not saying that these three issues are happening on purpose or they're happening all together, but if we look at the potential implications of translation into a human rights space, the toning down of human rights language, the market capture of human rights, is there a risk that the guiding principles are changing human rights for business rather than human rights being able to change business in itself? And I'll end then with some thoughts from scholars who are kind of similarly concerned with this idea of human rights and the process of translating human rights. So Sally Mary, coming back again, she contends that through the process of translating the human rights language of justice into rational or technical language of economics and management, does this reduce human rights' radical critique of social inequality and injustice? So human rights ideas are more easily adopted if they are packaged in familiar terms and do not disturb the established hierarchies, but they're more transformative if they challenge existing assumptions about power relationships. And then just to kind of finish on someone else that I've been reading recently, which is Boltanski and Chiapello, their New Spirit of Capitalism book. And this is the idea of capitalists' ability to absorb critique, so critique, like potential critique, like human rights, and extract value from it as well. And all this, I kind of want to sum up and say that all this is to say that accountability in itself can't be applauded. We need to scrutinize how these accountability practices work in practice. And this is why I think empirical work on how the guiding principles are used in the everyday is so important. Something that I also find really important, and it's something that I'm turning to now in my research, is this idea of experts in the business and human rights space, how they become experts in the human rights space, business and human rights space, how they legitimize this expertise, and what roles do they play in advising human rights or advising companies on their human rights implementation. And I think I'll just stop there. I might have gone really quickly into that, and I'll just stop my share there. I think that works. Okay, I'm happy to take questions if there
Sure.
are.
Thank you very much, Marisa. That was really very interesting. We do have one technical question, whether you can be quoted, whether your presentation can be quoted. You would prefer to wait for the paper to get out?
I think so. So the PhD is due, I say due to be finished, and everyone who is going through the PhD process will know that it never is really on time, but I think things should be coming out within the next year or two. And I'm really happy to talk to anyone individually if they have more questions on this as well later on.
All right, we have two questions and then two people wanting to ask a question. So that I first read out two questions that came through already. First one, can you say that there is a duty of directors of companies to address environmental issues? Human rights relate to enjoyment of a safe, healthy, and sustainable environment. This is one. And then second, have you found that business and human rights agenda has become more of a box-ticking activity for companies, downplaying thereby its true purpose or whitewashing their actions?
Can I ask you to repeat the first question? I wasn't really sure what the...
The question is whether you think that there is a fiduciary director's duty to address human rights and environmental impacts.
I have to say that's something that's a little bit out of my remit. I think, yeah, I would be hesitant to actually answer that question because I haven't really thought about that in great detail. But yeah, something that I definitely need to look into. I think the fiduciary duty. Yeah, I'm not really going to be good at answering that question, I don't think.
All right, and then the second question was about business and human rights agenda and it being a box-ticking exercise. Whether do you think we are moving towards that direction? I
don't think so. My opinion on this is from when I went into this research, I was quite skeptical of what happens when human rights go into corporations and corporate reporting. But I have to say that I think there's a lot of nuance in it, and I don't think we're going necessarily to a box-ticking exercise. My concern with the business and human rights agenda is that we are kind of, when corporations deliver a report or talk about a report, we are we just take them at their word